Hello. Today I want to talk to you about a recent book I read, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. I had to wait a long time for this one at the library, so I am excited to have read it and tell you my thoughts. So here is a quick review. Through meticulous research and powerful human stories, Rothstein reveals a history of racism hiding in plain sight and compels us to confront the consequences of the intentional, decades long government policies that created a segregated America. So, who is Richard Rothstein? Well, he has worked in economics and education for his career and has been associated with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, as well as the Economic Policy Institute. He published the book in 2017. And like I said, he's really been focused on educational policy. And as he looked at the achievement gap, um, he really began to become interested in the way that schools are still segregated today and looking at how that is happening and how the Supreme Court has responded to cases of segregation really is what fueled his research into this book. So, really, what he's looking at is that up until very recently, there were explicit racial policies that defined where whites and blacks should live. And that when that happens, when it is by state action or federal action, it's a violation of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And without the American public doing anything about that, we continue to have the effects of this de jure segregation, and we avoid confronting our obligation to reverse it. So that's really his goal, or his argument that he makes throughout his book. Just like Supreme Court justices, we as a nation have avoided contemplating remedies that because we've indulged in the comfortable delusion that our segregation has not resulted primarily from state action. And so we conclude there is not much we're required to do about it. Because once entrenched, segregation is difficult to reverse. The easiest course is to ignore it. So, for many Americans, the argument is that this segregation has just happened for a variety of reasons, but it was accidental or unintentional or because of some racial bigotry. And because of that, it's not the duty of Americans to do anything about it, but rather it just needs to resolve itself. And he really argues against that idea, saying, no, 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 this didn't happen by accident. This was intentional. And so that's what he spends his book trying to do. So in his first chapters, he's going to give many examples of of the government policies. And so when reading these, it almost felt painfully repetitive. Like, okay, here's another example. Here's another example. And it just kind of felt like, all right, I get the point. But in reality, that's essential. You can't just say, oh, here's this one example, because you have to see that it's not just in one city, in one state. It's not just one type of policy. You have to see that this was widespread, intentional, and the federal government was involved. So that's really what he does in these initial chapters. And then as the chapters move on, this is where I really got into the book, was the last half. He had his strongest arguments here, and he actually digs into the ideas of remedies. What should people do? And he recognizes that some of his solutions are not feasible. They would never happen. But it was still interesting to read potential solutions, because I think for a lot of people in reading it feels so immense that the average person maybe wouldn't have an idea of how to solve this ingrained issue that has been sanctioned by the federal and state governments. And so his potential remedies kind of get that idea or those thoughts moving. So the type of segregation that he's really addressing is where the separation of races is caused by law. And so he provides numerous examples, like I said. So some examples are that in projects after World War II, probably the most famous is Levittown. Builders and developers didn't have the funds to be able to build these massive new suburban areas without buyers. That just wasn't something that could be done. And so they had to have loans, and banks were not going to give those loans with that risky of a proposal. And so they needed government-backed loans, and the government required racial covenants. The government required that these homes only be sold to whites. And so that's one example. He provided examples of families that, so over time, there were laws that were passed banning racial discrimination or banning the enforcement of racial covenants. And so families did integrate. And there's this one story about this family, the Wades, who they couldn't buy the house. And so a friend of theirs, a white family, purchased the house first, and then they sold it to the Wades, an African American family. And it sparked these riots. I believe the home was firebombs, or for sure bricks thrown through the windows. And the police were there watching this happen, and they failed to protect the African Americans. And then additionally, they did arrest someone. They arrested the white man who sold them the home for inciting sedition. So he argues that this failure of the police and public officials to protect African Americans, despite what the law said, is also an example of the government supporting residential segregation. Public housing projects also were one of the main arguments or main examples that he provided. So he talked about how in the World War II, post-World War II era, there was a housing crisis. And that in order to get funding for public housing, they had to compromise. Republicans and Democrats had to compromise, and they decided to fund the public housing, but only if it was segregated. And, senators came forward and said, we believe it's better to have some housing, even if it's segregated, than no housing at all. But what it ended up doing was actually creating residential segregation in areas where it previously hadn't existed, and further creating a pattern of segregation in many, many other cities. Plus, there was just a disparity of projects, the quality of projects, the abundance of projects. While many white projects had vacancies, there weren't enough for many African Americans in places where they needed to work. And there were so many more. Those are just a few examples that he provided about the types of separation of races caused by law. So why is this important? Why is this book an important read? Well, he cites two separate textbooks and their basically entire section on residential segregation. You find, in an AP class, you're going to teach Levittown, you're going to teach about the growth of suburbanization. But at the same time is the growth of residential segregation. And that part is almost missing. Here's one sentence from a book published in 2012. African Americans found themselves forced into segregated neighborhoods. Well, who forced them? Why were they forced? What are all of the components? There's so much more that needs to be addressed there. And to not even address that, not even expand on that, is severely limiting of some essential information in American history. Here's another one from a book published in 2016. In the North, too, African Americans faced segregation and discrimination. Even where there were no explicit laws, de facto segregation, or segregation by unwritten custom or tradition, was a fact of life. African Americans in the North were denied housing in many neighborhoods. Again, this is just promoting that idea that it happened by accident or because people were bigoted, because people were white supremacists. But it doesn't address the government role. And without addressing the government role, it doesn't, it allows for people to absolve themselves to justify not doing anything about it. So important contributions, it's really the immensity of the examples provided, and it really debunks those arguments of just de facto segregation. He doesn't say, oh, it doesn't happen. There are examples of de facto segregation, but really his argument is to provide examples of the segregation by law. And then it's a call to arms. It's really asking people to care. It's asking people to do something about it, to pay attention. Many homes today still have racial covenants. They're not enforceable, but they still exist. And so it's really that call to arms trying to get people to make changes to an incredibly difficult and ingrained system. So lastly, one final quote. We have created a caste system in this country with African Americans kept exploited and geographically separate by racially explicit government policies. Although most of these policies are now off the books, they have never been remedied and their efforts endure. So I encourage you to pick up a copy of The Color of Law, learn more about how residential segregation began or continued, grew in its intensity, and let me know what you think.